What do you mean you don't have hot sauce? This is Texas. We put Tabasco on cornflakes. You can play it safe if you want to, but you gotta risk it to get that biscuit. When it comes to business, you gotta look out for the cookout. That's how we do it in Texas. What do you mean my accent is too southern? Well, we're fixing to get it on Solve for X. Welcome to Solve for X, the podcast where curiosity meets collaboration. I'm Dr. Rick Fernandez, your host on this journey into the heart of education and innovation. Welcome to another episode of Solve for X, where we're solving K-12's most problematic challenges. I'm here with guest, friend, first-timer to the show, former Superintendent, Middletown Public Schools, CEO, Agile Evolutionary Systems, Dr. Michael Connor. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Fernandez, for having me. Such an extraordinary honor. I'm inferring that our conversation now is going to be a carryover for when we had that extensive and great learning session, what I call that dinner in Dallas at Tapsy. So it's always good to see you, my friend.
Is that what you're calling it, a learning session at dinner? Okay, I like where your head is already. That's probably we'll just leave it there at that. But yes, no, we did have some great conversation, and man, you were sharing a little bit about your background, and I was fascinated. So if you wouldn't mind, just briefly, can you share a little bit about your career journey and what you've done and kind of some of the things you're embarking on now?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Fernandez. So started out as a fourth grade teacher. I always like to say I followed the traditional pathology in education that led to leadership. Fourth grade teacher, literacy curriculum specialist, assistant principal, assistant superintendent teaching and learning, chief academic officer, and then reaching that pinnacle as a superintendent. Have a traditional background in education, but it was in 2016. 16 was it, I believe. I went back to school and I went back to school. I already had obtained my doctorate degree, but I went back to school for business analytics because a mentor of mine, Dr. Rudy Crew, he's the former chancellor of New York City public schools and then also former superintendent in Miami. He said, Mike, what makes you different from every other educational leader, every other superintendent that's out there? And it made me reflect, Dr. Fernandez, of, okay, yeah, I have this background in education, have a background around system science, re-architecting models for transformation, but how could I become an outlier or a differentiator within the vertical or the ecosystem, I should say? And then I challenged myself and I went back to school, enrolled in the Harvard Business School in the business analytics program and learned basically pretty much a new language, a new method, a new approach around using data, big data, using data science for transformation, for advancements, for AI integration. And then fell in love with that program, was in that program for a year and a half. I had some of the greatest professors in the business analytics program. And then I immediately enrolled in the innovation, technology, and artificial intelligence advanced certificate program at MIT. Spent, again, another 18 months there, really now trying to merge business analytics, technology, artificial intelligence to be able to disrupt some of the traditional research norms and some of our practices and methodologies undergirding system science and broad change management and transformation. So it was kind of like this pipeline that led to what I'm doing now, where I have the Agile Evolutionary Group and AEG Systems. And in essence, it's an interface business model that focuses on research, science, advanced analytics, and artificial intelligence, rooted within my two conceptual models, the disruptive effect model and the 22nd century education model, to impact and influence various verticals, nodes within the operating model, really disrupting traditional leadership practices to now really go in and be instructional leaders with this, mind frame of AI and analytics simultaneously. So it's really, like I said, and Dr. Fernandez, it's really kind of like this differentiator in education that's an outlier that's truly challenging the education model right now to prepare us or move us into what I like to say this 22nd century readiness in education.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of points that I want to touch on, but if you allow me, I remember the first time I heard you speak, you came and were kind enough to speak to us at a Talus event. And I remember thinking, you know, because I feel like I'm a fairly well read individual, read every night. And there's nothing that I'm going to hear that I'm not going to know. And then I remember hearing you speak. I'm like, he just said about 14 words I'd never even heard of. And so I say that if you'll indulge me, tell a little bit about this. Tell me the story, you against the library, if you will.
Oh man, and you know what is funny is that I was just at an event speaking in New Jersey about what are some of those decisive moments in the education that led me to educational leadership. So I had to go to the root cause, which was the library. And what's great about this is that my mother, and I love her to death. She's the one that's really kind of framed who I am today in education. My after so really it wasn't any defined after school programs.
Right.
When we were going at that time, it was we get on the bus to go home. So, when my mother was working, she worked to 5:30. I got out at 2 o'clock, 1:59 to be exact. And Dr. Fernandez, literally my after school program was a library. And I had to so every day from 2nd grade all the way up to 8th grade, with the exception when I was in sports, obviously, I had to go to a library and it was 3 hours, right? So pretty much it was from 2 to like 5:30 to 3.5 hours, right? Where I was literally in a library and the librarian was my mother's best friend. So I couldn't even go out to like go outside of the library to see friends or even to walk around. And literally Dr. Fernandez, there was no iPhones at that time, we didn't even I always say we didn't even have enough. We weren't rich enough to even buy Game Boys. So essentially it was me and the library. So there's that old saying, Dr. Fernandez, if you can't beat them, join them. So essentially what I did was I was like, I succumbed to kind of like the library and I was like, you know what? Here's a challenge for myself. I'm going to read every book in this library. I remember telling my mother that, and she's like, "You're absolutely crazy." And I was like, "No, no, no. I mean, what else am I going to do? I'm going to do my homework, and then I'm going to read." So literally, Dr. Fernandez, I found because I had this intrinsic challenge of trying to read every single book in that library, and I had some time. I had some years actually I had some years and literally, I went through pretty much all of the books. So with the 100 level became the 200 level. The 200 level became upstairs where it was the 300 level. The 300 level became the periodicals. And this is where I developed a stamina for reading, but this is where I developed my affinity and my love for reading today. And just like you said, you read on an everyday basis. I try to accomplish of reading 45 books a year, right? And that's kind of like me keeping up with not only new trends in education or new trends, economic trends. I read a lot of the economist perspective, so to bring into strategize or strategies with education, but more in the lines of that prerequisite, right? That prerequisite that was built at such an early age, that foundational love for reading carries over to this day. When we think about, you were a superintendent as well, Dr. Fernandez, applying theory into action. I think that's where, the theoretical nodes around in education, per se, whatever the focus might be, teaching and learning, systems reimagination, operational integration, disrupting silos, that putting all that theory into practice came from that prerequisite of me being in a library from 2nd grade to 8th grade, 3.5 hours a day. And even when I had to go in the summer with my mother to her job, I had to sit there for a longer duration of time. And guess what I was doing? I was reading a book. So I don't even know if my mother, if it was strategic. I always asked her, was it a strategy? She said, no, you didn't have nobody to watch you after school.
It more necessity than strategy.
You're right. Exactly, Dr. Fernandez. But I'll tell you that necessity led to who I am today, which was an indirect strategy for that. But, knowing my son now, who's 10 years old, try put him in the library for 3.5 hours, it won't work.
Yeah,
So,
no, yeah,
yeah, no, no, no. It's a compelling story when I tell people about it. They're like, "That's why you love to read," and I was like, "Yeah, I had no other choice."
yeah. Yeah, you had to find a way, or it's going you're gonna die of boredom in that library. So you
You
can't
are
be.
absolutely right. You are absolutely right. There was some days, Dr. Fernandez, where I was just like, I got to do this again. It was.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's like you're shipwrecked and you're just like, huh, coconuts again. And then like some days you love the coconuts, some days it's about to kill you. I totally understand. I was trying not to derail us, but I had to ask you to share that story because I just thought that was the best story when we were at dinner that night.
Yeah, no, that it was great, it's a live story that I say to, everybody. If it wasn't for my mother, who, had this affinity for, education that, you really have to make it a top priority,
Sure.
and then to couple that, by putting me in the library, quote, unquote, as my after school program, and I just read books. I just read, I just read. And then when, transitioned into ninth grade, it was different. It was odd because, I didn't have to go to the library every day after school, because of after school activities, programs, sports, and all of that. But it became so accustomed in my life that when I transitioned from eighth grade to ninth grade, it was definitely I had to make some internal adjustments because I was just used to it. But I kept that affinity going, right? And I kept that affinity going, and that's why, it was funny because teachers would be like, "Oh, you didn't read through that book, that quick." And like, yeah, I've already built the stamina where I can read 5 to 6 chapters, in a 2 to 3 hour setting. It was because of that prerequisite experience that I had at the library, from second grade to eighth grade. So truly appreciative of that. Back then I wasn't laughing at it. I
Yeah.
couldn't stand it, but now looking back at it, we can laugh at it and say, you know what? If that didn't happen, I don't know where I would be, in the context of, education and having this love for independent education as a lifelong learner. That's why I went back to school, you know, in the business analytics program and the technology innovation and AI program is because I have this natural innate love for learning, especially learning new things.
Switching over to data and your expertise in analytics, you do bring a different lens that most traditional educators, superintendents don't necessarily have, and that's not part of our training, our education, our degrees. What if you can boil it down to one or two big buckets that we're missing as a lack of understanding about big data and analytics? Because when we say data, and we usually are thinking of student data, attendance data, maybe demographic data if you're in construction and trying to either build out or consolidate your schools. But that's very limited. What are some of the things that, man, this is a blind spot for educators now?
I think one, when we think about, and this is just exclusively to big data and analytics, we have to, as an ecosystem, and you and I talked about this, Dr. Fernandez, have to shift to underpinning and utilizing real time data in this sense where now that we're using or we have access to diverse data sets, but these data sets become integrated business intelligence or business logic for leaders to now have those foundational or those models I like to say in education that we're trying to improve or modernize, that we have to be able to now become adaptive and lean. And in order for us to adopt principles of being lean, of being adaptive, we have to have real time data to be able to guide those specific actions within the organization. We don't have, and this is not knocking education, but we don't have the necessary tools or we don't have the necessary artifacts to truly move the ecosystem to this real time IoT operational practices of using real time data to guide decision making, right? We
Right.
do a lot of the item analysis, error analysis, gap analysis, but we're analyzing data sets, in my opinion, that are old, even though they might be 30 days, 30 days, 45 days within the actual interpretation of these data sets to come up with strategies. If you think about the time of the administration of that assessment to the time that we get to comprehensive analysis to guide action steps or to guide workflows within our learning organizations or districts, the data is old. So we need to have data systems. We need to have standards that operationalizes on this real-time mechanism. Also, too, another huge shift, Dr. Fernandez, is that we have to move from what I call exactitude analyses. We do a lot of exactitude analyses, meaning that we do a lot of exact analysis of data sets. but we're not bringing in diverse data sets to bring them together to do what I call inexactitude analyses, right? How is operational data informing academic data to be able to transform different education spaces to be modernized? How are we now looking at human resources data, performance ratings of teachers, of leaders, to now go back and to impact the schools in the context of whether it be literacy or numeracy data? Those are inexactitude analyses. We don't do that as a collective capability in education, specifically around business intelligence around those specific data sets as well. So, I mean, if you think about it, I just read, Dr. Fernandez, that I believe less than 3% of industries or organizations within various industries truly do, to this level of fidelity, business intelligence analysis around diverse data sets. I would say that I would hypothesize that in education, we're even lower because, again, it's not a core capability within education. So I think that, if we start looking at real time data, if we start doing more inexactitude analyses, and I want to say this every single time I get a chance, every learning organization needs a data scientist,
Yes.
right? If we really truly want to operationalize inexactitude analyses, if we want to look at different correlations of different data variables and do predictive analytics, true predictive analytics that is on a real time manner, we need data scientists in education comprehensively. So, these are some of the things, right, that I learned being a part of being a part of my program, of like saying, okay, now let me bring in R and R Studio to really truly analyze the depth and the scope of my strategic operating plan. Let me bring in now exploratory data analysis using visualizations with my executive team to be able to do business intelligence to identify what are those next steps. That was learned in an analytical program or analytics program to be able to adopt and modify in the education ecosystem. And so that's what a lot of my work at Agile Evolutionary Group, the development and the design of the Agile diagnostic and AI platform that's embedded within AEG Systems, my edtech company, is to now help districts and leaders move towards using analytics and AI to be a part of the deeper strategy that is already existing within that learning organization.
Is it fair for me to say that, because this is my belief, that we are missing large variables when we're making decisions, particularly about student outcomes, right? Because the common ones are typically, obviously we look at student attendance, we look at, either grades and or standardized testing. We look at Lexile reading levels, cognitive ability, SAT, ACT, and try to make judgments on what's the best intervention for a student or the best acceleration. But I believe that we're missing a whole swath of other variables that impact all of those things and would not necessarily give us indications that we should do this or should do that. So we're kind of throwing darts. I still feel like even though all the data that we do have, we're still throwing darts. Is that a fair assessment for me to make?
Yeah, I think so, Dr. Fernandez, because if you think about it, we always say it, we're rich in data, right? We have a plethora of variety of data sets readily available to leaders and to us. We have an enormous amount of historical data, data that's archived. We have all of that. We just need the necessary systems and social capital to be able to go deeper with the analysis. And I think that we do a lot of signal analysis that is very topical that, we talk about, but we don't get to that root cause around where are how are we now the quantifications of making these changes strategically and not being afraid to experiment based off of the data. And we talked about this, Dr. Fernandez, is that we have to build those capabilities and that social capital within our learning organizations to be able to operationalize in that specific manner. So you're right. We do a very, very good job of really analyzing the signals and identifying specific interventions and strategies around the specific signals that we're analyzing. But again, why are we seeing these exacerbations of specific preparation and opportunity gaps? Why are we seeing exacerbation in the context of readiness and preparation for students for this 22nd century economy is because we're not really getting to that root cause or really getting deep into the systems level change and asking those catalytic questions to be able to move and guide our work forward. So it's not, again, it's not the fault of any educator
Right.
or any legislation or policy. It's just like you just said it. It's a different type of learning that isn't an embedded or rooted core competency of leaders in education.
So, speaking to that, I know you do some work with school boards and helping them develop a really intentional strategic planning process. And I'd want your thoughts on, how much are board members aware of what is needed in terms of really good data to be utilized for their guidance of a school district, but also, is this something that we need to maybe advocate that all of our programming that whether it's aspiring superintendent academies or from the higher ed side, that they start building in some of the things that you're sharing with school boards so that the next generation of school leaders have this blind spot can be mitigated, so that they don't have a blind spot when they step into the role. So kind of your work around the education of the data that you're using in the way that you're using it.
Yeah, and you said it, Dr. Fernandez, right? This has to be embedded in any type of principal leadership or superintendent leadership programs. This has to be embedded and available for deeper professional learning that's outside of the norms. One thing that I've learned is that if we want to bring in quote unquote innovative practices or practices that emulates whether it be around data science, statistical work, is that we have to have this large body of work that we know around data and systems. And we have to interject that into our structures, our systems of education, and bringing that learning together. And that's how, we have to develop the capacity,
Yeah.
with our leaders. We talk about with boards, I created a governance assessment tool that is around my disruptive effects model. And it looks at every tier tenant apparatus within a governance model and surgically take that apart and look at it from the context of how can we improve our governance model, looking at the analytics from that assessment. So it's not, your traditional, building capacity around compliance. Is really looking at how do we operationalize and govern using strategic thinking, strategic work, using that information to become data driven. So pretty much a data driven governance model is where I'm trying to move districts or I'm trying to move boards to the governance assessment tool. So and again, Rick, I mean Dr. Fernandez, this is bringing in all of the work around the analytics, around technology, innovation, and artificial intelligence into the model because my core theory of action or value proposition is how are we building systems level capacity with leaders, with board members, with community members around these practices that we cannot kick the can down the road anymore. We have to invite it. We have to embed this new learning. And we have to, as a learning organization and leadership team, or even leaders, is to comfortably feel uncomfortable with this learning, right? Because we have to unlearn to relearn to learn new practices. So it's going to be a core competency that we can't ignore. I always say, Dr. Fernandez, we used to be before we were the crazy ones that were thinking, from this outlier context. Well, now we're the cool people because we
Yeah.
have to. We have the levers to be able to build capabilities around these core competencies of what I call the 22nd century.
I thought for a minute you're going to say, I just take all the board members and put them in the library, and they gotta challenge the library to upskill themselves. I was like, that may be you might have just sold hundreds of millions of dollars in workshop right there across the nation.
And we only do Dr. Fernandez. Give me your phones. Give me all of your electronic devices. There is absolutely nothing but you in the books for 3.5 hours every day for
Yeah.
what, 7, 8 years?
Yeah, that buyback time that you just gave all the superintendents in the cabinet level, 3 hours a day, boy, that would be priceless.
It's not. I think that's the reason why. I always provide people with whether it be white papers, articles, books to read or something. We'll do it in the library.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's funny. Because you have the experience of an educator and as a superintendent, I've always found, as I've journeyed in the private sector in the ed tech space, how valuable do you feel it is for a district to work with somebody that intimately knows the education, practice, regardless of state or region of the country, but just the understanding of all of the variables that have to be addressed, not only to get work done, but also the political variables and all of the things that need to happen so that a district can move forward with something like, all right, we've got to redo how we think about data and the systems that we use. But just having a former superintendent that understands some of those dynamics, that it's not just check the box and we move. We're talking about probably wholesale change to some degree. Do you
Yeah.
find that like they're leaning on you a lot more than just for the data, but for your understanding of
Yeah.
systems and being an educator?
Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Fernandez, it's something when we can say that we sat in the seat, right? And, 10 times out of 10, any superintendent is, if they're experiencing something now, we probably experienced it, right? And we know what those, there's only a certain degree of understanding that, if a superintendent says, hey, I got 3 board members that are saying X, Y, and Z, and they're not going to vote this way. What can I do to be able to now deepen that core understanding of what I'm trying to bring in so I get those votes? There's only a certain understanding that certain
Yeah.
people can get with that. So absolutely, not only are we and this is why I love your work, Dr. Fernandez. Not only are we bringing this level of divergent thinking that's challenging the existing elements and tenets in education, but we also have that lived experience as well. I would have loved to have a Dr. Rick Fernandez as somebody that I could pick up and be like, hey, you know what, Rick, I need this help. And here's where I'm stuck at when we talk about AI, or here's where I'm stuck at when we talk about improving the efficiencies of my data systems. How data systems are structured within a district. What a superintendent is looking for when it comes to data systems. And now with your level of expertise, you know what that modernization and redesign strategy look like. And it becomes even contextual because you understand that there's context to every learning organization and community and even state, with regards to that. So yeah, I would have loved to have a Dr. Fernandez by my side with that,
I don't know
with
about
this
that
two.
one. I would say, hey man, you got to get your butt in that library, figure it out. That's gonna be the code word. Anytime that you get the call from
I'm gonna use that, Dr. Fernandez. Next time I talk to a superintendent, I'm just gonna be like, just go to the library. Sit in
hey,
the library
you
for
got library
that's
time. You got to spend some library
library
time.
time. Not no timeout time, library time. But yeah, no, it brings a different perspective when it's coming from, you know, somebody that been in that seat. I remember, I always used to challenge my companies, my ed tech companies or partners, external partners coming in that, A, you got to know my kids. B, you got to know what strategies that you're working on within my strategic plan. C, how are you going to interface, interdependently so that now we're eliminating silos, with that. So now being on this other side, the business education side of it, when I meet with districts and superintendents, it's all about, hey, I know where you are specifically when it comes to CCMR, benchmarks, and how are we going to be able to now create this trajectory of CTE pathways that integrate AI, but is closing those specific CCMR benchmarks. So I'm like, okay, yeah, Dr. Fernandez knows what I'm talking about, knows what I'm trying to do, bringing that, level of credibility, but also bringing that level of expertise simultaneously. So I think that now, is advantageous that, leaders seek out, people like Dr. Fernandez who sat in the seat, but also brings this dimension of innovation as well. So it wasn't when we were around, Rick, it wasn't readily available,
Right.
with that. Of course, we had mentors that really mentored us, in the seat, but from an external standpoint, really wasn't there. Now, with the plethora of leaders across the country who are making that jump into business education. Now, superintendents should be taking advantage of
Absolutely.
individual experts that can bring not only that experience, but also bring that divergent thinking to change
Yeah.
status quo.
I mean, there's a lot of value in trusting someone that you don't have the time in the seat to go explore what's available, what's financially feasible, and what's of biggest impact to my district. But if you trust somebody that's out there in it every day that can bring you options, that's gold, because the likelihood that your team is going to have the bandwidth to go explore and do an exhaustive search and know, okay, what is real and what is theoretical, from there's a lot of claims out there right now with all of the AI stuff going on. That time and trust value is really really crucial, particularly for district leaders that are now, it feels like, are younger and younger, being in that seat with less experience. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it's a piece of, well, they may not have all of the network that they might have had in 10, 15 years ago, climbing up the ladder.
Yeah.
So that trusted relationship is huge. And it kind of want to end our conversation on this. What are some, if I'm a district and I'm, I'll speak to Texas, right? So I'm up against it. I need to have some improvement in accountability. Maybe we're 1 or 2 years away from potential, intervention from the state. What are some first best steps to take as a district leader when kind of going down this road of, I got to get super super focused and intentional with everything that we're doing? Anything that you can point out from your expertise?
Yeah, I think that, you and we had a separate conversation with this. Um, Leaders must recognize that if you're at that stage, right, kind of like that year 3, 4 intervention, moving towards this reconstitution, one of the things that I always say about change management, that it has to have this level of coherence, obviously, discipline, execution. You can't look at it from the siloed or disparate context of the redesign, right? Because there's always this residual. If I just looked at it from the context of, okay, I have to improve literacy instruction, and just look at it just from that isolated vertical, then I'm not looking at it totality from a true systems lens where you have to truly impact everything. What are some of those extended or sub nodes, or I like to say verticals, that impact literacy instruction, teacher capacity, instructional leadership effectiveness, right? Systems that goes in resources to support that innovation in the context of what does it look like from a vertical coherence standpoint if we're integrating AI. So if we're looking at leaders, just don't look at it from this isolated context of just, I have to improve literacy scores. I have to improve my benchmarks within the CC MR goals, where now I have to look at the system and totality. And speaking of that, and we were talking about this before, that's kind of like what my platform, the Agile Diagnostic and AI platform, does. It doesn't look at that independent vertical, but it look at what is the system's impact around that independent vertical and how we can impact the system in totality, as opposed to just this isolation of improving literacy scores. So anybody, if it's Texas per se, before that, what is the broader systems design around coherence and improvement focused on, let's say, literacy outcomes, as an example. But yeah, have to look at it holistically, comprehensively, in the context of really moving the system around that vertical that we talked about of
No, that's a
literacy.
great point. No, it's a great point, because that is exactly what we do, and guilty as charged. And when I say we, me included, right? The mistake of seeing a deficiency or seeing students not learning at a certain grade level, certain content, and immediately try to intervene at the campus level with either more staff or more remediation, without the structures around it to make it successful, right? It's like if I want to go work out, right, and I start working out and all I'm doing is heavy lifting, but my diet's bad and I'm not sleeping, and my knees are bad, and none of those other components are a part of me wanting to either get more healthy or whatever. Then ultimately it's going to be doomed for failure, and that's exactly what we do a lot of times. Guilty as charged. So that's a great point of setting up the entirety of the system to have success is more than just one siloed, data set, a data point of
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
intervene.
That was a great example, Dr. Fernandez, because if let's say that, I have an elementary school that has, we've been identified because of, let's say, literacy instruction. Well, I know that those teachers are going to teach math. They're generalists. They're going to teach math. They're going to teach science. And the pedagogy within the classroom is probably replicated across content areas. So we might be cited for literacy focus, but we have to go beyond and say, what is the level of effectiveness and quality defined by that learning organization and that system, quality of instruction that is occurring in literacy, in numeracy, in science, in all of the defined areas. If it's a grade level problem, let's say grades 4 and 5, and students are not, let's say, going deep with the text around comprehension, it's not, it could be concentrated just to grade 4 and 5, but also what was the trajectory of learning? What was the trajectory at that foundational level, K1 and 2, with regards to strategies and methods behind the science of reading? So is it more like we got to strengthen instruction at the K2 level so that we can be able to close comprehension gaps in grades 4 and 5? That's what I mean, kind of like that systems
Yeah.
approach, as opposed to saying it's concentrated to these specific areas.
Yeah, setting yourself up for success. Okay, I know I've taken up a lot of your time. Can you take us out on a positive note? And what I mean by that, there's a lot of negativity in the education space, and for a variety of reasons, and probably some are valid, some are not so valid. But nevertheless, there's a lot to be positive about and positive for. What are some of the things you are most excited about for the opportunity of education? You're working with districts, you have an unbelievable system to help districts. What gets you excited about the possibilities for education?
The discussion around 22nd century education, right? And I always challenge people challenge people meaning stakeholders, board members, constituents, that if we're using 21st century vernacular, we are creating these implicit gaps of readiness and preparation for Generation Alpha, who are 11th graders and below. And then last year, we just welcomed Generation Beta, who was born on January 1, 2025. Generation Alpha considered the generative natives, Generation Beta considered the quantum natives. So now that we're talking about disruptive models without scaring people, bringing in words, phrases of vernacular that we never used to be able to use in education, experimentation. I mean, Dr. Fernandez, you and I, when I say, hey, I would like to run an A/B test where we're experimenting a different solution and tools. Back in the BC stage before COVID, parents and educators are like, our kids are not widgets. We're not experimenting on them. Where now experimentation is warranted because we want to be able to scale and systematize some of the best solutions in our schools. So being having conversations around Generation Alpha and Generation Beta, knowing that artificial intelligence is becoming this ubiquitous utility within the operating model. Now we're having engagements and discussions around how do we leverage or adopt AI. We're not at that arrival AI, which is more on the lines of being disruptive within the model. I always use the example of arrival AI in our natural life was electricity. Electricity disrupted our lives for good. That's the same thing of how we need to look at AI. How is AI going to disrupt the education model for good? So, but we're still at those foundational stages of exploring and experimenting with different tools. So, hey, we're at a stage where 7, 8 years ago, you and I would bring up AI, people would be like, it's never going to happen. Now we're having conversations and tinkering with artificial intelligence. So we're moving slow in this pathology. But again, truly appreciative that conversations are being welcomed. People are experimenting with it. And then also there's a mindset of being intentional about our two generational learners that we need to really focus on: Generation Alpha and Generation Beta.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I appreciate you joining me and spending some time as always. It's great to have a thought partner like yourself. You've got a lot of expertise, and the one thing that I pride myself in is like I clearly do not know it all, but try to find people and learn from people that are knowledge seekers and very naturally curious. And I think that's why we hit it off, because I was fascinated by what you were sharing. I was like, I gotta spend some time and pick this guy's brain. So
That's what I said to you. That's what I said about you, Dr. Fernandez. I mean, literally to your audience, literally, Dr. Fernandez, we spent 3 hours at dinner.
yeah.
It was a 3-hour geek session without any interruptions.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was great,
It
and
was not.
I'm looking forward to for more to come, and hopefully we can do some work together in the near future. I'm excited for you sharing this system, your expertise, and how to attack data with school boards, because that's something that they really need to wrap their minds around. So thank you for joining me. And to the fans out there, anybody that's listening or watching, um, I got a feeling Dr. Connor is going to turn that Me Against the Library into a children's book. I think that would be a great children's book opportunity right there. So be on the lookout for on Amazon for that at some point, because that's he's got to write that one. Exactly. But seriously, if you like what you heard and saw, please subscribe, like, share. And if you want to get in touch with Dr. Connor and talk about services, we'll put the description in the links below. And see you next time on Solve for X.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us on Solve for X. Please follow, like, and subscribe for more episodes. And until next time, keep asking the right questions and solving for X.